Welcome to WHRO's Weekly Edition. I'm Doug Boynton. In this week's program, we'll break down the complexity of no-body murder cases like the Cory Bigsby trial that began earlier this week in Hampton.
In cases where there's no body, the authorities have to prove that the alleged victim was actually killed and isn't just missing.
WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh speaks with military families about the stress they are under as shutdown speculation threatens their financial stability. WHRO's Ryan Murphy explains why Virginia lost 10% of farmland between 2017 and 2022. And finally, we'll bring you a comprehensive health roundup from February. But first, this news update from NPR. It's WHRO's Weekly Edition. 3 local ships, along with Marines from Camp Lejeune, are on their way home after nearly 8 months in the Middle East. WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh reported the story.
The USS Baton, USS Carter Hall, and the USS Mesa Verde and their Marines left the Mediterranean early Wednesday, bound for Norfolk. The amphibious Ready Group was most recently stationed off the coast of Israel. The Navy has had a heightened presence in the area since war broke out in Gaza in October. Before Israel, the ships carrying the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit from Camp Lejeune were positioned around the Red Sea. The Navy has fended off numerous attacks as the U.S. tries to keep commercial shipping open in the region after repeated attacks from Houthi rebels in Yemen. The USS Baton left Norfolk in July. The Norfolk-based carrier USS Eisenhower remains in the region. The Navy faces its longest engagement since World War II. Much of the response has fallen on troops and ships based around Norfolk. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
The Nansemond Indian Nation planted hundreds of trees in Suffolk last week. WHRO's climate reporter Katherine Hafner was there.
The Nansemond tribe has been working to restore a 70-acre ancestral village called Matnocktown. Katie Grigsby with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation helped develop the restoration plan. She says for a long time, the land was home to a mine operation. When the company left,
most of the soil and most of the conditions of the property were subpar. It was just kind of a breeding ground for invasive species.
This week's planting replaces invasive species with native ones like black gum and hackberry trees. Nikki Bass with the Nansemond Tribal Council says environmental stewardship is a core part of their culture.
We don't view the environment as separate from us. This is part of our family. These are our relatives. This is what has nurtured us for thousands of years.
She says the new trees are a small part of their long-term commitment to restoring local ecology. Katherine Hafner, WHRO News.
City and state officials say the Navy is considering a housing project that could cost up to $400 million in downtown Newport News. WHRO's Ryan Murphy explains why and what it could mean for the city.
Delegate Sia Price says the Navy wants to build housing for sailors living on ships undergoing maintenance at Newport News Shipbuilding. A state budget amendment approved by the House of Delegates would match 10% of whatever the Navy spends on building that, committing Virginia to up to $40 million. Price says the project would be a big improvement for sailors and also a huge move for the city's downtown.
Something of this size and of this magnitude could really help invest funds in an area that has been historically neglected.
The Navy hasn't confirmed plans to build new housing, but it has been looking at ways to improve living conditions for sailors at the shipyard after a rash of suicides in recent years. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
Pieces from one of the most comprehensive private collections of historic clothing are on display at Williamsburg's DeWitt Wallace Decorative Arts Museum. Cynthia Vaca Davis reports for WHRO.
Curator and educator Mary Deering collected thousands of historic pieces over a 50-year period. Neil Hurst is Colonial Williamsburg's curator of historic dress and textiles. He says the collection is a valuable educational resource.
So we have the garments, which are quite lovely, but she collected quite a bit of what we call textile documents, again, to sort of teach style and taste and fashion, but also how those things were printed, how those things were woven, what's the changing technology that allowed for those items to be created.
The new exhibit includes about 150 artifacts from Deering's collection dating from 1700 to 1840. Deering's collection is light-sensitive, so it has to be shown in year-long segments with 50 objects in each group. The exhibit opened in February and will continue for 3 years. Cynthia Vaca-Davis, WHRO News.
The trial of Cory Bigsby began this week. Bigsby is charged with the murder of his 4-year-old son, Cody, even though Cody's body has never been found. WHRO's Laura Fillion spoke with former prosecutor and legal scholar Laura Killinger of William and Mary Law School about the history of no-body murder cases in Virginia.
Let's start with the basics. Just how difficult is it to try a murder case with no body?
Well, in any murder case, the prosecutor has to prove that a particular person died at the hands of another person, and that the defendant is the one who did that. So in cases where there's no body, the authorities have to prove that the alleged victim was actually killed and isn't just missing. So it is significantly more difficult than in a regular murder case where you have a body that can be examined by a coroner and that can be identified by loved ones later on as the person who is deceased, and where you can, examine the body and determine the method of death.
There are a few cases in Virginia that set a precedent for this one, including the 1980 case of the Radford University student Gina Hall. It took about 40 years for her remains to be found, but Stephen Epperly was convicted for her murder long before that. Tell us more about how that case played out legally.
So that case really was sort of a cutting-edge case at the time because it was the first no-body case in Virginia. With that case, there was pretty much overwhelming circumstantial evidence. And it was the prosecutors piecing together that circumstantial evidence of people who had seen Epperly with Gina Renee Hall, and then when they found bloodstains on the cabin, and when they found fibers and things like that in the car of the trunk that was identified to connect to Epperly. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence in that particular case that allowed prosecutors to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. There was no statement or confession by Epperly, and in fact, Epperly maintained his innocence. And despite that, he was convicted and sentenced to life.
What other kind of evidence can the prosecution present in a case like Hall's in the 80s and now in the Bigsby case in 2024? Are there differences?
Oh, definitely. Well, certainly the developments in DNA evidence have been revolutionary for the criminal justice system, both in identifying and convicting people who did do it and in exonerating people who did not and who were wrongfully convicted of a crime. So that, of course, is a major factor in its difference in these cases since that time. In addition, there's been a lot more developments in other areas of forensic science, right? So, for instance, identification of fibers, identification of hair samples, and all kinds of things like that are much better. So there is quite a bit of different technology. Now, you had mentioned the different types of evidence. So circumstantial evidence, is something that a lot of times your listeners may have heard about in passing. And there is this mistaken belief out there that circumstantial evidence is not good and maybe is not even admissible. And that's just simply not true. Oftentimes, circumstantial evidence can be extremely helpful in these cases and is usually always admissible.
Cory Bigsby made written confessions in jail and then recanted them. A judge ruled in November those were admissible. Does that change anything about the way this trial would be handled?
Some people think, oh gosh, well, there's a confession or there's a statement. Isn't that, the end of the story? But a good defense attorney can poke holes through a confession. And so as a prosecutor, they will need to find as much corroborating evidence that shows independently that whatever the defendant said, the way they did it, really is borne out by corroborating evidence that they find either at the scene or afterward.
Laura Killinger of William and Mary Law School, thanks for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
An archaeological dig starting this week may hold some answers into the mystery of what happened at North Carolina's lost colony in the 1500s. Public Radio East's Annette Weston Riggs has more.
This week, archaeologists with the First Colony Foundation will start a new dig at Roanoke Island's Elizabethan Gardens, looking for more evidence of the Algonquin village of Waanawack that hosted Sir Walter Raleigh's explorers in 1584. The week-long dig, starting Monday, is the first of two the foundation has planned. The other will take place at Fort Raleigh later this spring. This upcoming dig builds on what the foundation calls tantalizing finds that were uncovered last summer, including shards of Algonquin pottery dating to that time and a ring of copper wire. About the size of a quarter, researchers say the loop could have been the earring of a Native American warrior. First Colony Foundation's Vice President for Research, Eric Klingelhofer, said the discovery of pottery used for cooking close to an apparent piece of Native American jewelry strongly confirms that they're digging in the midst of a settlement, and Waanawack is the only known village at that site. In eastern North Carolina, I'm Annette Weston, Public Radio East.
He called it a moonshot. Newport News Mayor Phil Jones announced that he plans to cut gun violence in the city by 15%. He said to the chief, "Are you listening?" WHRO's Michelle Hankerson has more.
Jones will create an Office of Community Safety. It will be staffed by a person who will tell city leaders how to address the root causes of gun violence, like economic instability, mental health challenges, and gaps in social services. He says money for it will be in the upcoming city budget.
We're able to find the money. We have a lot of unfilled positions that are currently in the city, but this is my top priority.
Jones made the announcement during his first State of the City speech. In addition to the new office, Newport News may cut fees for certain recreational programs and create a separate violence intervention staff position. Michelle Hankerson, WHRO News.
North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein and Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson easily won their party's primaries for governor. WUNC's Colin Campbell reported the story.
Robinson defeated two other candidates in yesterday's Republican primary, State Treasurer Dale Falwell and Salisbury Attorney Bill Graham. Graham and Falwell had criticized Robinson over his offensive remarks about the Holocaust, Jewish people, and other groups, but most GOP voters weren't persuaded. Robinson was endorsed by former President Donald Trump. In the Democratic primary, Stein beat former state Supreme Court Justice Mike Morgan and three lesser-known candidates. Both Stein and Robinson are already looking toward the general election, which is expected to be the most expensive governor's race in history. I'm Colin Campbell.
If it was a mystery novel, it would be The Case of the Disappearing Farms. Virginia lost thousands of farms, nearly 10% overall, between just 2017 and 2022. That data comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. WHRO's Ryan Murphy is back with a look at how that plays out locally.
Christina Tewan's family has grown blooming plants in greenhouses for generations, first in the Netherlands and then in Hampton Roads.
So this is one of our greenhouses, and this is mostly geraniums, as you can see.
She took over her father's 9-acre greenhouse farm in rural Chesapeake when he died in 2014. But the fields surrounding her greenhouses won't be farms for much longer. They've been sold to a developer who's planning hundreds of apartments, condos, and townhomes. A different development is already going up across the road.
Those homes are marching across that field.
Federal farm census figures show small and family-owned farms are disappearing particularly quickly. Chesapeake lost 27% of its farms between 2017 and 2022. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
Congress averted a federal government shutdown when it passed temporary spending bills, but more deadlines are ahead. Military families say they feel caught in the middle from the constant shutdown threats, which could leave them without paychecks. WHRO military reporter Steve Walsh is back with that story.
This is probably a little easier than meeting at the school during career day.
Heather Campbell took a break from volunteering at her children's school to talk about her family's anxiety over another possible government shutdown. The spouse of an Air Force officer, Campbell moved to Virginia 8 months ago.
It's one thing if it happens randomly, but it seems like it's happening more and more frequently, and on the mental load of a family, it's really exhausting.
She estimates the family spent $5,000 out of their own pocket on the move, and they need her husband's steady paychecks.
We know that military families are struggling to afford housing, are struggling to afford food, and we know that each move costs thousands of dollars out of pocket. So it's really unfair to ask military families to plan for themselves for a shutdown that they can't even prevent.
This is the fourth time since October that Congress has had to pass a short-term spending bill to avoid a shutdown. Stopgap bills called continuing resolutions freeze the budget at last year's level, so the Pentagon doesn't have the additional money to fund some of the new quality of life projects passed by Congress, says Corey Titus, a former Army officer and policy director for the Military Officers Association.
So especially if there's a need to start a new project, their hands are definitely tied in ways that they do not need to be right now.
Money to replace and refurbish barracks for young service members and an increase in the housing allowance for troops in expensive areas remains on hold, Titus says.
It hurts service members in ways they don't necessarily realize because things could be better, regardless of their barracks, their pays, if Congress was able to get their funding bills done on a timely manner.
Troops separated from their families get an extra $250 a month to help with expenses. Congress raised that to $400 in the last defense bill, but the Pentagon hasn't implemented the increase.
That additional $150 when your service member is away at training would make a big difference for a family.
And it's not just the defense budget. More than 200,000 military families qualify for food subsidies under the Women, Infant, and Children, or WIC program. That's run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Bessa Pinchatti heads the National Military Family Association.
We're asking more and more of our service members and their families. It's painful to have these conversations with families, not have the answers. I feel like we're banging our head up against the wall.
The situation is worse in Virginia, California, and other places where the cost of living is higher, she says.
We're hearing how military communities are banding together to support each other and families that they know are having a hard time because they don't know where to go for resources, or in a lot of cases don't feel comfortable raising their hand and saying that they need help.
Multiple shutdown deadlines are coming in March. If Congress can avoid halting critical services or troops missing a paycheck, then the impact may be minimal. But the constant worry can lead some people to consider leaving the military, Pinchatti says.
They know that signing up to do the job is going to be a sacrifice for their family, but we do it every day and we do it for our country. There just comes a point where that sacrifice can't be worth it when you don't know if you're going to be paid.
She says the dire headlines have come up so often that crisis fatigue has set in, because all military families can do is wait. Steve Walsh, WHRO News.
This is WHRO's Weekly Edition. Remember, for any stories you've missed, you can visit us on the WHRO smartphone app or all social media platforms.
2 humpback whales were found dead near the Virginia Beach oceanfront in recent days. WHRO's Catherine Hafner returns with details on that story.
On Sunday, a humpback whale washed ashore at the oceanfront after being spotted floating near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. The Virginia Aquarium is working to determine the whale's cause of death. The same day, a different dead humpback was spotted floating a few miles off Rudy Inlet. Whales along the East Coast have been dying at a high rate for nearly a decade. Collisions with ships or getting caught in fishing gear are usually to blame. Marine biologist Andrew Reed with Duke University previously told WHRO that climate change is also affecting whales' patterns.
And humpbacks in particular, it's bringing those whales closer to shore where they're more vulnerable to entanglement of fishing gear and ship strikes, which are also the two leading causes of death for that species.
Humpbacks pass by Virginia this time of year on their way north to feed. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
Hampton Road's shipping channel has been widened to allow 2 ultra-large cargo ships to pass each other. WHRO's Ryan Murphy reported that story too and explains why two-way traffic is such a big deal for the port.
Port of Virginia spokesman Joe Harris says until this month, huge cargo ships would have to wait their turn to get in and out of Hampton Roads' harbor.
The big ships come in and the Coast Guard closes the channel for 4 hours to ensure safe passage. That's not terribly efficient.
The port has spent $450 million over the last 5 years to widen the channel. As of this month, Virginia becomes the only East Coast port that can accommodate two-way traffic. The change will speed up turnaround times by about 15%. Harris says getting cargo ships in and out of the port faster will make the already bustling terminals in Portsmouth and Norfolk even more attractive to shipping companies. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
And it's time for the February Health Roundup. I spoke earlier with reporter Laura Fillion about this month's health news, including student mental health, what communities in the Outer Banks are doing to attract more doctors, and new clinics in Hampton Roads. Let's jump right in with student mental health. There's an ongoing study at Old Dominion researching the effects of meditation. Tell us a little about it.
A joint effort between some ODU professors and the group Sky Campus Happiness will look at the benefits of meditation and breathwork on students' mental health.
And what do they hope to find?
Well, we're only about halfway through the study right now, but I spoke to 3 students who said they're using what they've been learning in the program to improve their everyday mental health. One of them is nursing student Caitlin C.
My mind is more at ease. I'm able to cope with things better.
Student mental health is an increasingly pressing concern for colleges in the wake of COVID-19 lockdowns and extended isolation. Even though this crop of students wasn't in college during the pandemic, they still feel the effects.
One of your reports this month was about the Nansemond Nation opening a clinic in Portsmouth. Tell me about it.
Fishing Point Healthcare will serve as a primary care practice, not just for tribal members, but also Medicaid recipients and the uninsured. Under federal law, Indian Health Services or the tribes themselves can administer care to their population. Tribal counselor and Fishing Point board chair David Darling said it's their mission to care for not just tribal members, but also other federal payees, like people with Medicaid.
We absolutely feel like we have an obligation, right? By taking our sovereignty and growing into this role that we're doing, we're now able to reach out and extend help to others.
Another clinic had news this month as well.
The Western Tidewater Free Clinic officially opened its 1,000 square foot dental care expansion this week, adding 2 new dental exam chairs. It also added a new behavioral health room where telehealth services will be available to patients. The clinic serves the residents of Isle of Wight, Surrey, Sussex, and Southampton counties, and the cities of Suffolk and Franklin. To qualify for care at the clinic, patients must be uninsured and ineligible for Medicaid or VA benefits.
You also reported on some health news from the Outer Banks, something about a new training program for medical students?
The Outer Banks have faced a dwindling number of providers since the onset of COVID-19. Now, a partnership between Mantio's Healthcare Task Force and the North Carolina Medical Society may offer a solution. They're launching a preceptor or training program based in the Outer Banks. Franklin Walker is with the Medical Society.
One of the best ways to secure the future for healthcare in Mantio or any other community will build a strong pipeline.
The program will start with 2 trainees at Mantio Community Health Center locations in Mantio, Ocracoke, and Englehart this fall. The hope is that creating connections between these students and the communities will attract them back once they finish their degrees.
Finally, Centera announced its participation in a nationwide cancer study. Tell me more.
Centera is part of a new partnership between the healthcare system and the National Cancer Institute. The study will collect data on multi-cancer detection tests, a new development in the field that many people hold hope for. Centera is one of 8 groups nationwide collecting data for the study.
And that's the Health Roundup for February. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Doug.
Join us next month to hear more about the health stories from our area. You've been listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We had help today from WHRO's Steve Walsh, Catherine Hafner, Ryan Murphy, Cynthia Vaca Davis, Laura Fillion, Michelle Hankerson, and Barry Graham. Annette Weston Riggs with Public Radio East, and Colin Campbell with WUNC. Also Connor Worley, who produced today's program. A reminder, you can always catch full episodes on the Weekly Edition podcast feed, and you can always get news updates at WHRO.org and the WHRO Reports podcast feed. For all of us at WHRO and WHRV, I'm Doug Boynton. Stay safe. Be well.